So if you could picture, a young child falls down and he scrapes his knee, or he gets bullied at school, or something happens to him and he runs home in a dysregulated state again, right? Because emotions are high, he's anxious, and he runs home and, his mother or father or parent says to him, oh, it's just a scraped knee. Stop being such a sissy. Get back out there. Or you're being bullied. You need to fight back. What's the matter with you? Don't be so weak. What happens in those moments is the child learns something, which is if they make themselves vulnerable, right? If they turn to somebody for support, for comforting, that the world, the parents or the world, is a very dangerous place. So instead of being met with an empathic, attuned response that's affectively resonating with them, like, oh no, you fell and you hurt yourself. Let me take a look at that. Oh, it's not too bad. We could clean that up. Instead, they learn if I put an emotion out there, it's dangerous and I'm going to be made to feel ashamed. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, you'll hear a clip from an interview I did with Olivia, the host of Achieving Success with Olivia Atkin. I bring you into our discussion right at the point where she's asking me to define narcissism. From there, we get into how narcissism is, in large part, about regulating one's self-esteem, a struggle to maintain a stable sense of self that often depends on external validation or what we call narcissistic supplies. And don't worry, I'll go into that in some detail. When I start to discuss how early experiences of shame and a lack of emotional attunement can shape this fragile self-structure, Olivia spontaneously shares a powerful personal story about growing up with a medical diagnosis and being bullied. We discuss how those experiences shape who we are today. It's an honest and deeply human conversation about self-esteem, trauma, and the complex ways we learn to protect ourselves. Let me get right into it. So without further delay, here's a clip from that interview. I hope you find it both insightful and revealing.
That being said, I want to dive into what I think is a really important fundamental question about what you do and really a baseline into being able to dive deep on this topic. Narcissism, I think there's so many different idealisms of what the word actually represents. What does it actually mean? What can it look like? And even sadly today, sometimes individuals throw it out as like a weapon, right? They'll be like, well, you're being narcissistic. Well, you're using it as a hurtful word without even sometimes potentially meaning like what they're saying.
Yes.
It can be weaponized. So the question I have for you is, what is narcissism?
That's a big question. Like you said, it's used in so many different ways. There are a lot of different definitions. But one definition that I subscribe to is, in part, it's about managing one's sense of self. In other words, always looking to regulate one's self-esteem or sense of self. And what I mean by that is one's image, how we feel about, how we imagine other people are seeing us. So narcissism, the main goal is to regulate self-esteem. And the way that people do that is through, and this is a word that's used in my field, is getting what's known as narcissistic supplies, which means that these are the people who are always looking externally for someone to regulate their self-esteem. So as you can imagine then, admiration, attention, being the center of everything, those things become incredibly important to them. And when they feel like they're not the center or they're not getting that admiration or attention that's desperately needed, that's when they begin to run into some problems, right? And that may be the other things that you hear, Olivia, that the narcissist can be this and they could be that, they could be mean, they could be cruel, they could devalue you, right? All of those things happen in order for them, believe it or not, to regulate their self-esteem, if that makes sense. So I would say it's a disorder of regulating one's self-esteem and always getting the supplies and all of what happens when they don't get those narcissistic supplies.
Talking about the narcissistic supplies and being able to regulate self-esteem, in your opinion and your vast knowledge on the topic, what do you think are contributing factors or mindsets that will build someone up to a point where the self-esteem is not showing up the same way it shows up for others, or the need to, as you mentioned, like potentially tear other people down or be that center of everything going on to regulate their own self-esteem?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's like what factors lead up to this, let's call it precarious sense of self or self-esteem?
Yes.
Okay, so can I give another example? I like examples, by the way. I always find them to be, like, it's where the rubber meets the road, I say. I find them to be very valuable.
I love examples, so you can give examples all day long.
Okay, great. Sometimes it's better than just bringing in all the theory, which I'm happy to talk about theory as well, but, they overlap. So if you could picture, a young child falls down and he scrapes his knee, or he gets bullied at school, or something happens to him and he runs home in a dysregulated state again, right? Because emotions are high, he's anxious, and he runs home and his mother or father or parent says to him, "Oh, it's just a scraped knee. Stop being such a sissy. Get back out there." And by the way, these are real stories. I'm not just making this up. This is the way parents sometimes talk to their children. Or you're being bullied, you need to fight back. What's the matter with you? Don't be so weak. So what happens in those moments is the child learns something, which is if they make themselves vulnerable, right? If they turn to somebody for support, right? For comforting, that the world, the parents or the world, is a very dangerous place. So instead of being met with an empathic, attuned response that's affectively, resonating with them, like, "Oh no, you fell and you hurt yourself. Let me take a look at that. Oh, it's not too bad. We could clean that up." Instead, they learn, if I put an emotion out there, it's dangerous and I'm going to be made to feel ashamed. So shame is a big part of self-esteem, right? Embarrassment, humiliation. So in other words, instead of, I just borrowed just a little bit of jargon, instead of internalizing a comforting voice then that they could carry around with them, at times of anxiety, and they could pull on that, they have this more punitive inner voice or discouraging inner voice, and they don't end up feeling too good about themselves because the implicit message is what? You're not accepted. Who you are, and your emotions are not accepted here. You need to behave in a different way. So all of that leads into what we call self-esteem, because self-esteem, one definition, is the discrepancy between how I would like to see myself and how I actually see myself. Mm-hmm. So the bigger the gap, the lower the self-esteem. And you can imagine if you get a lot of those responses, not every now and then, but if they grow up with those responses and they're very consistent, the sense of self, how I feel, my worth, my value begins to diminish, or it just never develops, I should say.
Brought up something I want to dive deeper into is because in those examples, okay, and every family dynamic is different. Every environment is different, right? One thing that came to my mind is when I was young, I was bullied. I, at 9 years old, was diagnosed with a rare form of epilepsy. And one day I went from training for the Junior Olympics and, all A's and being that great student to not being able to swim, my grades plummeting because I couldn't understand what was being taught, to being told, like, you might not even be able to learn normally or have normal brain function by the time you are in middle school and high school. Yes. That was not my case, but try explaining a rare form of epilepsy where even today, a lot of people don't know what epilepsy is and what it could look like and all of this and that to a 9-year-old and to a 9-year-old's friends and their parents and the school. And so very quickly, for needing an aide to be with me in classrooms and like even to go to the bathroom, I needed someone to walk with me. My friends started bullying me and I got bullied by some of those parents as well. And my parents stepped in and were, had a mix of responses. The defense response to defend me and like go to bat for me, trying to calm me, be like, it is okay. Like, we're going to handle it this way. And also like my dad getting to a point where when one of the girls started getting physical, he was like, okay, we're teaching you how to fight. You're going to fight back. right? So in my head, some of those experiences resonated when you were saying that. But the question I have is like, okay, maybe you get a mix of that during circumstances, or you get more of the like what you were saying of the brush it off, it'll be fine, stop
Yes.
being a what, more of that extreme. But as you grow up and you experience them and different situations and those patterns keep happening, what have you found to be some of the differentials and paths that those children start to develop and go down? Like myself, who, I mean, maybe we all have narcissism tendencies. I shouldn't say like there's individuals who don't, but I don't try to sabotage other people and their success or what they're doing or any of that, versus someone who sees a threat coming, whether it's an individual into a friend group or family dynamic changing or, you know, workplace, and goes, okay, now I have to burn it down.
One thing, I was listening to you very carefully, and one thing that I did not hear, and now you're speaking sort of spontaneously, Olivia. I understand that. So it may have been omitted and it really happened, but you didn't include it. So one thing that went missing was a parent sitting down with you and helping you process all of what it meant to be diagnosed initially. See, because I hear many of these stories, by the way, where kids come in with a lot of different trauma when they're young, you know, from medical diagnoses to being bullied, right, to being abused, etc. And it's not necessarily that event that is traumatic. I know that sounds paradoxical, but it's the way the event is handled in the environment. Now, you had parents who said, we're going to teach you this, or we're going to intervene. And on the surface, all those things seem very loving and caring. Like you have somebody on your side, which is helpful, by the way. It's better than, the reaction that I gave in that prototypical example a moment ago. But what I didn't hear in any of those examples is, my gosh, what is this like for you? How are you doing, Olivia? Let's talk about what it means to you. How are you picturing life? What a big loss. You were on this trajectory. And not only was it that loss, but now it's a double loss because now your friends are bullying you. So that's the trauma, by the way, because what somebody needs when they go through something like you did, it was two things, right? Two is someone to help contain the emotions, which means you have to be in a position to really listen. So I have a fellow who came on my podcast and was having some problems with his daughter, and she wasn't getting up for school. And I went over it very specifically with him, kind of like what happened with you a moment ago. And he would compare her to like her younger sister, for instance, stop being a baby, or come on, you could do it. If she could do it, you could do it. But the one thing that was missing, and I spoke to him about, was how come she's not getting out of bed? And he's like, I don't know. But that's what needs to be held and contained. But to do that, you have to make yourself vulnerable. So not all parents do that. It's much easier, believe it or not, to come in and say, let's fight, or like muster up the courage and do this, but being there and being more vulnerable, letting the emotions come out and containing them and giving them back in a way that then Olivia can make sense of what's going on in her life inside of her is really meaningful. So I don't know if I answered the question directly, but you were trying to differentiate what happens because the two kids can have trauma growing up. And one of the things that will differentiate how they do later in life, I'm only mentioning one, is the environment and how the environment responds to what seems like the trauma. But the real trauma I'm suggesting everybody consider is, what was the reaction? Were you able to talk to somebody, a loved one, and really get this stuff out and begin to metabolize and make sense out of it?
Well, I love the mindset there too, is like asking the in-depth questions and going, okay, what is that person feeling? Or are you letting the emotions come out? Now, I will say, I did not bring up, my parents ask those questions all the time of like, how you're doing, how do you need support? Let's walk through this. Now, part of why I left it out is like, I'm just telling a story.
Yeah.
So I will say they asked it so much. And to this day, I still get asked, partially because my dad is a doctor and my mom's a therapist. She's a doctor as well. So I grew up in the house, that being a very normal daily occurrence question.
Yes.
So it doesn't even think. And I think that's part of it too, is like when you have certain questions be asked frequently of like, how are you feeling? How are you processing this? How can I support you? And it made me think of this when you were responding to your answer. then when you look back and you reflect, those aren't the questions that pop up when you're telling a story because they become so baseline in what
Yeah, it's the norm. Yeah, it's the norm. It's like the air that you breathe, right? You don't think about the air, right? Unless it goes missing, you see?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it really begins to hurt you. So yeah, that's why I wanted to be very careful when I said I listened closely and you left it out. But we're on a podcast and we're talking very quickly and things are coming up. So, but you know, it makes sense that you grew up in this kind of environment because the latter part of your story was, how come I didn't grow up to be one of these people who's looking to undermine or blow up somebody else's success, right? So you didn't turn out. So that tells us, or it implies that you did have an opportunity then somewhere along the way to process these feelings so they don't need to come out, or we call it acting out, right? Against somebody else, as somebody else's success.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there.
So that being said, I want to go kind of into two different camps here and touch on both, but we can go one and then the other. Don't feel the need to try to answer both at the same time. But for an individual, and we could talk in presence of adults in this case, if someone has these tendencies and needs support, what is moments of realization you find with working with individuals where they're like, okay, I have these tendencies, I need to work with them. How do I work on this? And vice versa. If someone is like myself, dealing with someone who you're seeing is trying to be destructive, trying to tear family dynamics apart, trying to tear work relationships apart because of what you've brought up already, how can they and is there a way to show support and try to diffuse situations without escalating situations as well?
You're taking up something that a lot of my listeners write in about, which is, you know, when I'm listening to the podcast, I don't know if you're speaking to my loved one or if it's me. Like, this stuff gets very confusing, right? In other words, I think that my partner is struggling with these narcissistic or identifying with, exhibiting these narcissistic traits. But on the other hand, as I listen, what I realize is that I too may get caught up in some of this. And this gets very confusing because I'm behaving in ways that I never behaved before. You know, I got in this relationship, for instance. So for someone who is exhibiting these narcissistic traits, some of the things that they will recognize, and I'll just mention again some of the bigger ones, which is the whole structure of the narcissist I mentioned earlier is based on this precarious self-esteem and sense of self. And they're constantly looking to get the supplies. But we didn't go, just to go a step further, is what happens when they don't get the supplies. So someone who can identify with these traits will frequently experience moments of elation, feeling great, in control, at one with the world or their partner, in sync, right? But this is a fantasy. And like any fantasy, reality will penetrate eventually. And for someone who has this kind of structure, they oscillate at that moment. In other words, someone who has healthy self-esteem, like I mentioned earlier, internalizes that more maternal or paternal smile, let's say, you know, when they scratch their knee or they get bullied. But for someone who didn't get that growing up, they have nothing to fall back on, so they oscillate. So once the supplies go missing, once everything is not fantastic, a couple of things can happen. One is the self-esteem, self-worth plummets quickly. And they could fall into what looks like depression. I call it more of a narcissistic slight, but they could become depressed or very anxious, right? And they can become, depending on how they defend themselves against the, this precarious or this painful blow to their self-esteem, again, when they're not being glorified, they could get very defensive. So this is the kind of person you can't talk to. You can never give any feedback to them. You can never even have a different opinion because they get defensive immediately. Other people, because they're all different types of narcissism, not that there are different types, but the way it gets presented is different. So other people may get angry and attack you, and other people may withdraw and become very clingy and needy and demanding. I could keep going. Other people can become seductive. Some can become manipulative. This is why this diagnosis or even these traits are very complicated. So many different presentations and iterations of what could happen. But overall, what these people will notice is they feel really good, right? And that could go on for a while as long as everything is going accordingly. But once something happens, they plummet. And this is what we call the collapse of the grandiose sense of self. So that's one way that somebody who's exhibiting these traits would recognize it. So before we go into camp, does that help answer the question, or did I?
No, it does. And the one follow-up question I have to that is you brought up how, and I'm going to just quickly relate to epilepsy because it is much true, is that it can look different to different individuals, right? In epilepsy, for example, you can have grand mal seizures, you can have acute, they could be staring events, they could be feeling like you're on repeat throughout the day and repeating things. So it can look very different to different people. It sounds like with narcissism tendency and when that self-esteem plummets and the situation comes up, it can look very different depending on the individual and their past experiences. And my question to that is it also dependent on the situation they feel boxed into, where like someone who has narcissism tendencies or gets this plummet, I should say, when they get this plummet, depending on the situation, they could become very defensive, or they could become a mix of defensive and attack mode, or so on or so forth? Or is it like, hey, this person, when they hit this level, they will only show this, or they will only show that?
Yeah. It's never like only, it's predominantly. So like that's their defensive choice. That's the one that's worked for them their whole life. That's the way they know they could try to get back the supplies that they need to breathe. But there's overlap. Yes. So the short answer to your question is it depends. I'm sorry, I can't be a little more specific, but it depends, because if one trick or tool, let's say, isn't working, that doesn't mean they can't try another one. So someone can go from crying and being desperate, and when they don't get the response they're looking for, suddenly they become angry and they're accusing you. So you see that for sure, because then they think, or they can withdraw. Because if they think, just for example, oh, well, if the crying isn't working and I withdraw, maybe they'll pursue me. So I will ice them out. In other words, I won't respond to their text messages all day, but that may be gratifying because now they're texting me saying, hey, what's wrong? Did I do, let's talk. You don't need. So you have to be creative with narcissism. They have to be creative to make sure that whatever they do, they end up at the end of the day, remember, regulating their self-esteem and getting those supplies that they need and whatever it takes to get there. But that doesn't mean they're going to become a sociopath. I mean, that's a big stretch. You see what I mean? So I would say within reason, they would try different tactics.
Gotcha. Well, that answered my question.
If you're enjoying this discussion, stay tuned. I'll be sharing another part of my conversation with Olivia, where we take the discussion even deeper. She brings in a powerful real-life example about a family member who's dividing the family and creating conflict. Together, we explore how to recognize when someone's behavior is suggestive, or I could say is similar to, narcissistic traits. And I walk Olivia through how to engage a family member like this, but not by arguing or proving who's right, but by finding a way back into their subjective experience. In other words, trying to understand why is it that they're creating this family drama and conflict. It's an insightful exchange on how to find and use your own voice while navigating complex family dynamics. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts or questions, as always, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what stood out or what you'd like me to focus on more in the future. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, Please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.